Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Why are we in this handbasket? Before I introduce our guest today, I want to make sure you know who I am. I am Richard Littauer, the normal host of this podcast. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here. And I'm joined today by two guests, which is great, by Jan Lehnardt from Berlin. Jan, how are you doing?
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. And by Alba Herrerías Ramírez, whose name I have not pronounced correctly. But Alba, how are you doing?
I'm great. I think you have done great.
I try very hard. I am still Anglophone. Alba's joining us from Gran Canaria and the Canary Islands. Both Alba and Jan are joining us today from Neighbourhoodie, which is a kind of a consultant company. We wanted to have Jan on the podcast in particular for a long time, largely because Neighbourhoodie is where a good friend of mine has worked before, Gregor Martinez, who I think we've also had on this podcast. If we haven't, remind me and we'll try to get him on. And I'm just really excited to talk about it. It's one of my favorite examples of how you can do open source in the wild while also continuing to, say, get paid. That's probably the best intro I can start with. Just so you know, Jan and Alba have been around for a very long time and working on open source, which is really cool. Jan in particular has been an active developer on open source ecosystems for 25 years. He works on Mustache, CouchDB, Greenkeeper, PHP. And he was also the co-organizer for JSConf EU in Berlin for a long time, which was a super fun conference to go to back in the day when I think I went to it, or at least got serious FOMO on the socials. Jan, I know you're the CEO. Were you one of the founders of Neighbourhoodie? And in your time there, have you managed to work on a pitch to tell people what it actually is?
Very good question. Yeah, I helped make this a company about 10 years ago, originally with the goal of making this, supporting the then nascent Hoodie open source project, which we've since somewhat put to the sidelines. The goal was to have two separate entities so that when the company puts out an open source project in its own name and then the company goes under or the VC runs out or whatever, and then the project goes away, we wanted to not have that. But for us, the company stayed and the open source project kind of went by the wayside a little bit. We're still doing the same kinds of things, offline first, kind of web development, consulting, special focus on CouchDB stuff, because that's what it's all based on. And most recently, working with the Sovereign Tech Fund here in Germany to help other open source projects do as good as they possibly can.
Tell me a bit more about how the project went away. I mean, when you have a project and it's in the open source environment, you normally have a lot of dedicated people who are not part of, say, the paid part. Were they angry that it sort of fizzled out? Was there a lot of blood under the bridge? What happened there?
We never quite finished it and realized what we wanted is a lot of work and never quite gotten around to getting enough momentum to get it finished. And also the environment that we were in wasn't quite ready to have a thing like Hoodie. If I want to explain Hoodie today, it's like it's Firebase, but open source. But that was 3 years before Firebase was a thing. So we had to talk to people about what the browser talks to a backend, direct to database directly. And there's backend stuff you can trigger from the front end directly. Now this is the normalest thing in the world. We were just too early. We missed the wave there, and kind of a pattern with me, but I'm fine with this. About the impact, there were a few people who were really, really invested in Hoodie. And for them, it wasn't great. We kind of stopped working on it. For me, though, Hoodie is a bit of veneer on top of CouchDB and PouchDB, which are separate individual projects that run on their own and are still running. So anyone who was using Hoodie at the time could kind of keep continuing living in this world and work on those. And our focus now these days is on Couch and Pouch, and other things are like bespoke for whoever needs stuff.
Okay, I have a few clarifying questions. First off, Neighbourhoodie is spelled IE at the end, so it's Neighbourhood.ie. Is it actually based in Ireland? Has it ever been based in Ireland?
No, for a long time I was into novelty domains and I thought that would be really cute. And we got Hood.ie for Hoodie when we thought, like, we spent a long time figuring out what the open source project could be named. And Hoodie felt nice and cozy to us. We know there's other connotations, but that's what it was for us. And happened to have a friend in Ireland that helped us get that Hood.ie address that has since been snagged up by domain grabbers, so don't go there. And yeah, when it came time to make the company domain, we just went for the same scheme. I wouldn't necessarily do that again these days, but here we are.
Thank you. That settles a very long question in my mind. Another question that isn't clear is how large is Neighbourhoodie at the moment? When you talk about your consultancy, how many people are we talking?
We're 15 overall, 85% technical. The rest do all the work that's required. So we're an actual company. So they do all the hard work. We just get to play with computers and make our customers happy. Slow and steady growth, trying to provide a decent work environment for everybody, try to get good projects, that kind of stuff. We're not interested in hyper growth or any of that stuff.
I love that. You mentioned earlier PouchDB, CouchDB, and then you use this word offline first. These are all JavaScript projects and a JavaScript methodology for working. Can you explain a bit more? Do you only do work on JavaScript projects that also work in a browser without internet, or do you do other stuff?
It's a good question. So the thing that we're really, 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 really good at is CouchDB, of which I'm the project lead. It's a database server. It's actually written in Erlang, which is very nerdy. Very good for concurrency. We can do a lot of things at the same time. It scales very well, that kind of stuff. Very good big database if you need one. But it has this one unique feature that it allows to do data replication or data synchronization conceptually in the same way that Git does. So you can move data around from one source to a target, like a Git push-pull kind of thing. And it will figure out all the things that need to do for making the databases look the same. 2011, 2012, the PouchDB project emerged, which said, hey, it would be nice if a browser could do that same synchronization with the database. So we have a JavaScript implementation of the CouchDB synchronization protocol. They're wrapped up in the PouchDB project. So you can build a website that stores some data that can be seamlessly replicated or synchronized back into the backend. But it also can do a workflow where when you're online, you take some data from the backend into the front end and it stays there. And you go offline and continue work with the data as it is your main database. So you do data entry if you are like a customer support person and you have to go out into everybody's houses and, I don't know, fix the sink or whatever you do in your customer service work where you have to be in the field, but you don't necessarily have an internet connection. And so you can do all your data entry that you need to do there, you're ordering spare parts, whatever, just keeps working in the website. And then when you come back online, all the data can be seamlessly synchronized back to the backend. Conflict handling is like a natural part of all this. It'll be all figured out for you. And it's been doing that for, like I said, 15 years. And that's our sweet spot. That's what we're really good at. And it's kind of beyond the scope what we want to talk about here today. Some really nice, like very good use cases and some very like high profile humanitarian situations where this was the only tech that was available to do any of that sort of stuff. And we did some really important things like work on the first Ebola vaccine, which is kind of a big deal in my book. I'm very proud of this one. It's all just web technology. So if somebody wants to hire us to build a website that does the thing, either old school, server rendered, or a single page app in whatever framework of the minute you want it to be written in, we're seeing ourselves less as like technologists, but we help customers with their problems. They want to achieve a certain thing, and then we figure that out for them and make sure they get to do the stuff they want to do.
How do you keep from having clients who just want you to build a website to showcase the next capitalist shoe product or something? How do you keep your work open source and focus on interesting technological problems?
Oh, it's an amazing ethical question. We don't. We have customers that pay us good money that are ethically questionable. Like, not saying that's a strategy. We're not looking out for them, but as a small, like relatively small, medium company, we have to look where we are. Our main expense is our employee salary. We don't have like a significant runway. We're doing fine in both senses of the word. So sometimes we have to take on a customer that we would rather not to pay the bills. And then that allows us then to either work pro bono on certain things or work on an open source rate for some stuff. And then whatever spare money we have, we put into the open source projects that we care about and just donate actual working time there. That said, we do have some hard lines. Like if a certain type of customer would approach us, we would just flat out say, no, we're not going to work for you. Specifically, military contractors can solve their own problems. We're not interested in any of that.
When you say we invest our money back into open source projects, why do you invest your money back into open source projects instead of, say, back into the company to hire more people?
Good question. Like some of this, of course, happens as well. But the part of our business that we didn't really talk about is we're doing professional services around Couch and Pouch. So if you have an app that's built on that, you can hire us to see, hey, how can we reach the next scaling goal? Or, hey, we have these ongoing issues or these background issues that are really problems, but we know, we have a big, board meeting coming up and we must make sure it runs real smooth. Can you help us fix a bunch of stuff? Or we're running mission critical stuff. We need firsthand support for this kind of stuff so that if something goes up, we can help you. You might remember a couple of years ago, OVH had a full data center burned to the ground. We had a customer in the data center, but CouchDB has a multi-site replication feature built in. So that was one of the 3 data centers the stuff was in. So we didn't lose any data that day, but it was all hands on deck to make sure that customer is taken care of properly because they are holding half of Belgium's medical records in the database. So we've got to make sure that keeps up.
15 people, small consultancy, half of Belgium's medical records, and the Ebola virus. Sounds like you're doing a lot of work. I want to segue to another project that you have at the moment, which is the Sovereign Tech Fund grant. So the Sovereign Tech Fund is a large pot of money coming out of the German government, and now I think also other investors. And it's basically tagged for open source work and for large open source infrastructures. They're trying to build out a better solution to solve some of our tech stack problems in the world in general. We've talked about them before. We've had some people from the Sovereign Tech Fund either on this podcast or on other podcasts I've hosted, like the Digital Infrastructure podcast, which I can drop a link for in the chat. Alba, can you tell me a bit more about what this project looks like on your end and how STF is working with you?
So I'm currently the lead developer on Neighbourhoodie, taking care of the STF project. And we have a communication with the STF. They send us different set of projects. We meet with them and we see what we can do for them. There are many areas that we can help them. And it's actually very nice because sometimes we meet with projects whose stack is very different from the ones we are used to work with. And there's always home for us to help them.
So you're not working directly on a project for STF. You're sort of coming in as advisors to help figure out how other people's projects can better work.
No, not really. Actually, we first have a meeting with them. We outline some of the necessities that they have for the project to move on. And we sketch some sort of contract, what we call statement of work, what we outlined the tasks that we can do for them. Once that is agreed, we form a group of people to work on the said tasks.
And that group is a set of Neighbourhoodie developers. So we're doing the direct work that we then contribute to open source projects. Our deliverable is a pull request, usually, that makes a certain specific change.
How do you figure out what sort of work you're doing for STF? Is this like, there's a hole in the internet and that needs to be filled? Or is it more, we have this maintainer who has an open source project and they're working really hard, but they don't yet have this feature X enabled. We'll work with them to make sure that happens.
I think the process is the projects applied to the STF and then the STF send us our way so we can communicate with them.
Right. The way this is framed is the STF's bug resilience program, where the idea is that open source projects should be prepared for the situations where their critical infrastructure and a security issue is found in their code base. And then they need to be able to respond to that quickly, handle the disclosure safely and securely, and be in general prepared for security issues. So the original idea from the German government was like, hey, can you please do a bug bounty program for open source projects? And when STF then said, let's talk to a handful of projects, how would you like a bug bounty program? And every project said, like, hell no, that would be a lot of work because like everybody and their cousin would send on whatever exploit they could find, or even like pretend they found or use automated tooling to send a lot of really low quality submissions to this, because once you put money into this kind of thing, there's the incentives change a little bit. So the STF went back and said, no, okay, we need to first make projects resilient against the situation that actually something comes up. And that's where they reframed their own mission statement. And then we've taken this mission statement to say, hey, here's all the things that an open source project could be doing to be like maximally prepared for bug resilience. And that covers things like be easy to approach so you can regularly onboard more people. Make sure you have your processes defined so that one person doesn't get burnt out on having to do the releases all the time or that kind of stuff. And like I said, it's a larger document. And then the SDF sends that to the open source project and they can say, hey, here's the kind of stuff that we need from that menu. But that's usually only half the story. When we get into actually talking to them, we talk a bit about ourselves and they talk about themselves. And relatively quickly, they will, on the spur of the moment, think of like 10 other things that they had in the back of their head that they even haven't formally specified. Where we say, sometimes the best thing we can do to make you more bug resilient is like take busy work off you. Oh, you have 10 legacy websites from the last 15 years that need consolidation. It's not security work or preparation for security work, but we take that away from you so you can focus on the important stuff. Plus, then the project is more approachable for newcomers. So we can always phrase it in a, here's how this is useful. And sometimes this isn't directly useful security work. But on the other hand, sometimes we also write like unit tests in C and find bugs in your DNS packet parser. Spans the whole gamut of that kind of stuff.
So I'm naive about way too many things in the world. One of them is how large funders integrate with third-party providers to enable the grants they do to have longer legs. So a lot of times a large funder will have a set of consultancies who they work with to basically help their projects that they want to give money to, because they say, oh, we notice they need design work. Let's say hire Superbloom to come in and help them do their design work. And that's great. I use Superbloom as an example because they're the best. Errol's on this podcast all the time. They're awesome. What I never really understood is how those funders ensure that money isn't going to the third-party providers as a major bucket of money, as opposed to the projects themselves that need work. Now, this is a really difficult question for you to answer because it may be kind of awkward, but I am curious about the long-term sustainability of a project like STF. If there are third-party contractors like Neighbourhoodie who are, say, taking busy work off of maintainers, how do you know that you're not just taking work that would otherwise go into the maintainer's pocket and go to that project itself? Is there a line you have to straddle there? We're saying we can't do X amount of work. And do you know how STF thinks about that?
Alba outlined earlier that the initial agreement, the statement of work that we do between the project, Neighbourhoodie, and the STF, it's a contract. Like, it's not just a document we do. It includes milestones and estimations for how long they will take. And they will have to be agreed upon by us, by the project, and by the STF. So either party can say, well, we agreed to do this milestone. We estimated it's this long. And then the project says, well, it really should take you only half the time. What are you doing? And then we can say, well, we can try to cut it down a little bit, but like we also, maybe we're new to the project and we put in some buffer to like get to learn the project when we talk about challenges later. Like the onboarding is a significant piece of work, let's say that. And the STF can then also say, hey, no, Neighbourhoodie was actually right in estimating this a little bit more generously. That's fine. That's actually a situation that we had. But the STF always has final say, approvals to say, hey, Neighbourhoodie, these amount of person days or person hours for a certain milestone, that's really out of scope for our program. You can't do this. They can always tell us. I think we had a bit of leeway in the beginning of the project because none of the structure was there. So we developed the structure while we did the first projects. But I think very quickly we attuned to the sensibilities of both projects and the STF. I don't think we ever had a milestone denied on estimation or scope grounds. We're trying to find a good balance. Like for some projects, take some busy work off has a bit of a majority focus, but that was also the most important thing that we could do for them at that time. That might not be the same situation a year later, but that also means we freed them up so they could do other stuff. And then projects can reapply so we can maybe do a second round of the actual work, then know that we've unblocked them in a certain way. But we want to brag about the work that we want to do. So we can't always say that we fixed 1 million websites because that's not very exciting from a security perspective. But we're trying to help the projects where they need the most help. And like I said, usually they come up with a list of things that we want to do. And the STF mostly agrees that that's important work.
Did the relationship with STF start and continue because you're German?
This was a public tender, so anyone could apply. And I think because it's a German government program, we're bound by EU law, so any European company could probably have submitted to this. Their main doing business address isn't even in Berlin, but the STF people all are in Berlin that we only found out later after we signed all the contracts. So, yeah.
It wasn't a very serious question. I know STF has given money to other people, chief among them GNOME, which is, a 501c3 based in the US.
That might be important to say. Any project around the world can apply, like anybody. As long as you have OSI approved open source licensing, anybody can come. And please do apply.
You mentioned earlier that you work with projects to ensure that they don't, say, get a huge amount of bugs. This reminds me of a conversation I had with Daniel Stenberg, also on this podcast, where there was a bug bounty program for curl and people started submitting AI CVEs everywhere. It's just like, oh, I found this bug and it's not really a bug and it's written by AI and he just has to deal with them. And that's just an incredible amount of work and effort. We also, of course, have the current XYZ.T debacle going on at NPM, which is now a graveyard filled with tons of little tiny packages that developers are trying to say, look at me, I'm part of the ecosystem, give me $5 at scale, which is just really, really crappy. Can you tell me a bit about how the work that you both do and the other 13 of you stops, say, that sort of crap from happening? How do you ensure that you're not just leaving holes in the system for various moneymakers trying to exploit it?
I don't think I have an answer to this. This isn't a specific goal. You cited valuable and valid examples, but most of the projects that we work with haven't had to deal with this just yet, or that's just not on their roadmap of things to worry about just yet. So I don't think that's a specific focus of the work that we're doing. A bunch of the milestones that we do are like run-of-the-mill development tasks, like update this to all the new dependencies so we don't have any like security issues in those anymore. So all these like static dependency tracking tools will fall off the bandwagon there. Another thing that we do is increase test coverage or improve CI matrices so that automated testing covers more ground, which cuts down on a lot of this as well. But I think these are all side effects of stuff that open source projects need anyway. And then that just helps with this aspect. So I don't think that's a specific focus on this.
I was hoping for a silver bullet. Obviously, that's not the case when you're dealing with, things like exploiters. It's an arms race. You have to just keep one step ahead, which is really tough. So sorry for the trick question. Thanks
no, it's fine.
Handling it gracefully. So you're not working directly with a single project for STF. It's not like you're the STF project. It's more like you work with various people. Alba, can you tell me a bit more about what sort of projects you're working with?
Yes, we work for a variety of projects that are very different between each other. For example, we work with different PGP implementations, like, for example, OpenPGP.js or Sequoia. The first one is an implementation in JavaScript, and the second is an implementation in Rust with help Yocto, which allows you to make your own distribution of Linux, for example, for embedded systems by PI, systemd, of course, PHP, Log4j, prefix, and also, for example, reproducible builds.
It sounds like those are a lot of different projects, which is awesome. Obviously, you're calling in from the Canaries, a place where you have a lot of sun, so you don't get depressed. In Berlin, it's actually very difficult to do any work because it's just a horrible place to live. So I'm just curious, how do you work best with all these different cultures and different projects? How do you ensure that everyone's on the same page and that you understand what's going on between intercultural systems?
That's an amazing way to phrase this. I'm not saying it's a challenge and it's a thing that's annoying, but it's a hard thing. Like if you do software long enough, you realize that the technical problems are just the sideshow and everything else. You have to solve things on the people layer instead of the technology layer. And what's fun for us is to go into these many very different projects and just learn how they work. Many of them use GitHub. Some of them use patches and mailing lists, and you have to use git send mail on the command line to send patches. There's only one other project that I know that does this, but they do as well, and it's fine. Some communicate real quick, some communicate slower, some are in way different time zones. Some assume like they're very narrow, very deep in their space because that's what they need. They're like very, like if you're doing a PGP implementation, you have to be like on point to do this correctly. And so that's your whole universe. And yeah, just like accounting for all these differences. I see for the team as a great learning opportunity to see what's out there so that the current monoculture of everything is on GitHub is not the only truth out there. So I think that's nice. But it also means that we earmark, when in each hour of our statements of work, we earmark some time for project communication where we have some buffer. So we account for some of the differences there so that we can adjust and attune to what each project needs so we can do the best work for them.
As you're going through and learning about all these different projects and learning about how they work, you have to be updating your internal Bayesian priors all the time to ensure that you have a good idea about what makes a project more sustainable. Because obviously every new project that you find that works differently than you think it should, that actually is doing okay, is going to have to update you. So I guess it'd be difficult to point to a single project or a single solution for how to make open source sustainable, because obviously that's not how the world works. And your entire job, in some sense, is doing this for other open source projects. But if you could try and answer this impossible question anyway, how do you figure out how to help a project when it's different than any project you've seen before? How do you know that?
First, we do a little bit of research about the projects and the code bases a little bit. And then it's just magical because in the first meeting, we always find space for us to help. Even if they're very different from each other, there's always work. It's just amazing. Especially with the later projects, we also send them the statement of work of other projects so they can see what we have done for the others. And that also gives them ideas on the areas that we work and they can incorporate in their own project.
You've spoken so far about the projects you integrate with, and you've talked a bit about what some of them are and who you work with, and you form an SOW, and then the SCF funds you, and everyone lives and everyone is happy, and we all get to go have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in the park. That's great. As we all know, open source is ridiculous and redonkulous, and there's no single project. There's just a ton of maintainers with their ideas about what a project is. And every single time there's project leadership in an open source project, there's 5-10 people in the wings who totally disagree with that project leadership and want something else to happen. How on earth do you work with open source people to try to have an idea about what a project is and should be in a way that makes everyone happy?
I want to be very careful to phrase this, but the main driver is the projects themselves. So we're not going to go in and tell them what to do. One of the biggest open source projects or most used open source projects in the world, and half a person is doing their IT infrastructure where everybody downloads the binaries from. That's not a sustainable setup. So we're going to help them. But we're not going to go in and say, well, here's the perfect solution, adopt it. We'll talk to them. We'll see, hey, where are you? What is your most dire need? What can we exactly help with? What are you comfortable with using? And then we can say, hey, there's a bunch of tools that can help with this. And they have these, say for server administration, there's Chef and Puppet and Ansible. We have some experience with Ansible, but maybe this particular project doesn't want to take on a Python dependency, which Ansible is, because they're a different programming language naturally. So maybe they don't want to do this. And what they need is very small scale. So maybe we can do this in Bash rather than Python, because the scope is fine there. And most of the other tooling is in Bash already, so it doesn't really make a difference. So we'll try to work with them. We're not going to be the big consulting company that comes in and says, we know best. It's just, we have the person power to do stuff for you. And we come with a bunch of experience that we can help with, but we're never going to dictate anything into the project. The other thing that you mentioned is interesting. Sometimes an open source project doesn't know what it wants, or parts of the open source project want one thing and then others need another thing. And in the past, we helped mediate that a little bit to say, if there's a money budget and a time budget, we can freely think about what's the most important thing to do. And then someone will say, well, this is more important than the other thing. And the others say, well, this is more urgent than the other thing, or doing this first is important so we can do the other thing. And maybe there's some dependencies there. And we're just in open communication with them to figure out what the best step forward is then. We didn't have a lot of this, thankfully. That has happened, though, where one part of the group wanted to go in one direction and the others wanted to go in another direction, and we helped mediate this a little bit. Well, we can say we have some experience with this from our own open source projects and the other ones we did under the SDF project. So we're not only consulting on the actual technology, but also how to figure this out.
I'm glad you mentioned Bash. Jan, you're famous for being someone who only uses Bash scripts and hates all other types of scripting. And by famous, I mean you too did that recently on Mastodon. And so one of my questions for you is, if you write a bash script for a client and then they find out there's a bug 6 months later, how are you not on the hook for every single client that you've ever worked with to continue to like maintain them in the long run? Because in open source, that tends to be what happens. You're like, oh, well, this person wrote it. Let's just ping them. How do you avoid that?
In like non-open source consulting, I think by the way we do our stuff is that we go on, do our thing, and teach the people who take whatever on, know how to like take responsibility for this. Otherwise, we would have a differently structured business arrangement. Then we would have a long-term support contract to say, hey, this part of this client's infrastructure, we are now responsible for. And then we can basically do whatever we want and write as many shell scripts as we like. But if it is hey, this is a Python shop, we have to write the tooling in Python if we know we're gone in 6 months. And that's just what we do. And the same applies to the open source project. We're not going to go in and build something that works for us and then leave them with it. That will be antithetical to what the SDF wants to do.
So I like the idea of SOWs being a very clear boundary on work done and on what's possible. That makes a lot of sense to me. Boundaries are the best thing in open source. They keep everything in there. And, Mike McQuaid has talked about that before. Being able to say no to people and just turn offline is awesome and really helps you as a maintainer. It seems like it also helps you as a consultancy firm, saying, here's what we do. We're not doing more than that. So I've learned a lot more about your project over the past 30 minutes, which is exciting. And more accurately, I've learned a lot more about your business. Now, you mentioned earlier the Neighbourhoodie used to be a project, and now it sort of isn't. And it seems like you're making your open source work sustainable by continuing to be a consultant, by continuing to learn new technologies, and by working with the hot funders of the moment to ensure that you do the best for open source people. Is there some sense to which your work in open source has failed because you're no longer working on a single project and now you're just people out for hire in the open source ecosystem?
Yeah, I love how you retconned our strategy there, because of course we set out 10 years ago, like, yeah, this is what we're going to be doing. And here we are. All of this came organically. Like I said, a lot of us have been doing open source for a while. We built a business around open source deliberately to help that project move forward. So I sometimes wish we would be better at business to say, hey, more money comes out at the end so we can do even more open source work. It's not that I care about open source specifically, but I care deeply about CouchDB and PouchDB because, like I said, they allow some very unique humanitarian use cases that no other project really can do. And I want to keep that around for the foreseeable future. So in a way, that's a bit of a failure. I would have loved to work on these projects a lot more. I have at least 10 years of roadmap for each project in my head that will take a while to get to. And I could have been halfway there if I didn't bother with any of the other stuff, but then it would be only me or only Alba or only anyone else who's here. And then we would have to figure out how to pay rent anyway. So I wouldn't ever go so far as to say this is a grand old strategy and this is how you do it. But it's the old saying where it's like, if you care about it, you make time for it. And we make time for open source. And by proxy, that says we care about open source. But like I said, we want to provide a nice work environment. We don't want to overwork everybody. We are a European, specifically German company, which from an American perspective has ludicrous healthcare and holiday situations that all needs to be paid for, which we happily do. And we're very lucky in that regard that we are in a society that allows us to do all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, we need to make some money and people need to pay rent. And you have to have some money on the side for the kids and for going on vacation and whatnot. So in that regard, Neighbourhoodie is like any other business. Other companies spend their money on other frivolous things, or I don't know, get everybody a car. We don't need, it's not a thing that we need to be doing. Plus, the folks that work at Neighbourhoodie generally enjoy working with open source communities. So it's usually great fun, and Alba can speak to that maybe a little bit for how you first started using as a project and later actually joined PouchDB as a project and worked on that.
Yes, I actually started working at Pouch because we got hired for it and then just started doing open source for it. So that's great.
And Alba went from sending a patch here and there to being the release manager for the last 2 major releases. So, or 3, I forget. So it's not a little thing that she does. She's like a core part of the project now.
I think ludicrous is the wrong word. Sensible. Those sound like sensible policies to me. I really enjoy hearing about all this. I've one more hardball before we start to wrap up. You mentioned OSI approved licenses. You've mentioned open source a lot. You've also mentioned humanitarian work and how great it is. It's very easy to mention things that go well. You mentioned you don't work for military contractors. Open source means you can't limit who's using your work. So why open source as like the giant ideology that you're supporting? Why not say ethical source, or why not just humanitarian work directly? What is it about open source that makes you feel like we want to work on open source projects themselves as opposed to just cool projects with awesome people?
I'm going to try to see how I can phrase this like for myself and for the company. But I think open source for us is just the thing that everybody understands. Like if I talk to you, I can differentiate between ethical source or just doing humanitarian work, or the intricacies between GitLab and GitHub and the policies around that, or what it means to be an Apache project versus a Linux Foundation project and all that jazz. But if we talk to other people, especially funders or some clients or literally anybody else, people understand open source because of Firefox. And then maybe Linux. Like regular people understand that Firefox is open source. That's a thing that they've heard of. You can make even for-profit open source, that's fine. But like in general, that's what people understand. It's a non-profit kind of situation. Personally, I'm very excited about the recent year movement into moving away from open source as is, or not moving away, or like exploring spaces about more as ethical sourcing or avoiding certain areas of work or types of companies or the software can be applied to. And if that was available 20 years ago, I think I would be all over it. But we got into open source at the time, and that's just the thing we have right now. But we're not doing this to the exclusion of the other things. And I really hope that some of the ethical sourcing initiatives get a lot more traction and make it normal that we say, hey, certain people we don't agree with whatever it is they're doing, so we exclude them, and that must be okay. And we need to have discussions about that. I do remember for the first time when I heard that a certain entity that I don't agree with was using some of my open source software. I understood that I can't do anything about it because of the benefits that open source affords me is that everybody can use it, and the downside is that everybody can use it. So there wasn't I can do one or the other. That at the time, that was a binary choice. And I'd rather have all the good things that come with open source, and then I don't actually actively engage with the other side of it. But yeah, we want to see more ethical source. Do this. Please, people, get on this.
Hopefully this last question isn't a hard ball. What are some highlights from your work? What's been really fun?
I'm especially proud of the CVEs. We filed CVEs corrections to NIST that impacted the whole open source community. So far, we had 32 updated, and we sent over 80. They actually sent us an email saying that they are training people, so we should expect delays on answers. We're especially proud of that.
We love to think that they hired people just because we flooded them with updates to the CVE database. I think it's because of some other thing, and we just got caught up in that. But this is really fun. This was for the Yocto project. Like Alba said earlier, it is a build your own Linux distribution kind of stuff, but they inherit all the open CVEs from all open source projects because you can build your own bundled packages for everything. So if ImageMagick has an open CVE and you want to bundle that, then your Linux distribution gets flagged by automatic static checkers for that kind of stuff. So we went in, and I don't know how many ImageMagick, but like over 20, I want to say, ImageMagick CVEs had incorrect version numbers applied to them. So certain bugs said we're open in this version, but don't have a fixed version or have a wrong fixed version. So we went into did some real internet archaeology for some texts. I think the earliest one that I did is open like an Xorg PDF from 1993 for like an Xorg release 5R something to see which Xterm version is included in there to see, hey, can we actually close this CVE so people don't get tracked anymore? And the thing that makes it so fun, like why I'm so proud of this work, is that it applies to all of open source. This isn't just good for Yocto. This is good for anyone using these projects. It's like universally useful. It was very tedious work for some of my colleagues who had to slog through all of this, but they should know I'm very proud of what we did here.
I love that. Where can people follow along with Neighbourhoodie's ongoing success and or failure? And where can they follow along with you two? Do you have social media accounts, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, for Neighbourhoodie, I think it's just Neighbourhood.ie, our website. We have a blog where we post about the stuff. We recently started a series about doing a recap for all the projects that we've done. Like the first 2 are out already, so you can check those out. If you have any questions, send them to us. And then I'm Jan at Neighbourhood.ie if you want to email me. I have a website at writing.jan.io and janl@narrative.es for my Mastodon.
Alba?
Yes, I have a website, albaherrerías.dev. Then I'm also on LinkedIn, Mastodon, and formerly Twitter. So you just can send me a message there.
And all those links will, of course, be on the show notes at podcast.sustainoss.org. Jan and Alba, it's been great talking to you today. It's been really fun to learn more about Neighbourhoodie. I should have had this conversation 10 years ago because I've known about Neighbourhoodie for a long time, and now it just makes a whole lot more sense to me what's been going on. So thank you so much for coming on and helping elucidate that. It's been a ton of fun. Don't leave yet, though. At the end of every show, we have Spotlight, the part where we point out other people's projects, other people, and things that we just feel need a bit more light put on them. Traditionally, the host goes first, so I'm on the spot, but I've been thinking about it for a while. I looked up, and I was really surprised about this. I actually haven't had Gregor Martinez on this podcast. I've had his partner on the podcast, which is really fun, on the DIF podcast, which I'll put in the show notes. But Justin also spotlighted him on episode 100, and I spotlighted the entire JS community on episode 74. But this is episode like 575. Okay, not 370, late 200s. And I've never spotlighted Gregor, and I just feel really bad about that. Gregor Martinez is awesome. He's one of my favorite people in open source. I really just love his work. I also know that his work has recently just involved just being a dad to triplets. So I think that's really what he's spending a lot of his time on. But if you're not familiar with Gregor Martinez, he's just an amazing coder who helped me a lot and was also part of the Neighbourhoodie project for a while. So just want to say thank you to him for teaching me how to be a nice person in open source. Jan, what is your spotlight today?
I want to highlight a web framework that we've been working with for a while that I really admire. It's called Adonis.js. Ostensibly, it's a Laravel reimplementation in TypeScript. So you can use it from TypeScript and JavaScript, and is a Rails-like full-stack web development framework, but it's really, really, really well done. It's a small team, very dedicated team. It's now at version 6. So I've been working in this space for a long, long time, and this is just the best implementation of this kind of solution. I want to give it a shout out. The Adonis.js team is amazing. They're really helpful, and they just keep shipping high quality products that allows us to do a lot of consulting in very little time. And we're very happy to support them both financially and by shouting them out on podcasts.
Alba?
I would like to highlight PouchDB. It's a project that has a big part in my heart, and it has allowed me to do big things. And sometimes I even get approached by people I know from hackathons saying, hey, you're working in PouchDB. And I was like, yes, I'm super happy to be part of it. And I would like to highlight it.
Thank you so much. This is really, really cool. It's been great having you on. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast as well. If you have, there are a lot of things you can do. 1, tell your friends. Podcasts only work because you tell other people and how awesome they are. 2, go to the show notes, podcast.sustainoss.org. You can find all the links that we mentioned earlier. You can find other podcasts that have happened in the past that are really, really exciting. You can also email me and let me know what your thoughts are. That's podcast@sustainoss.org. Or you can find us on Mastodon or Blue Sky or LinkedIn. And finally, you can donate. We are under $10,000 in funds. It costs money to make this podcast, which means we will die in another year or two if we don't find large institutional sponsors at X place that you work. Which means please, please, please think about possibly funding this podcast and continue to work highlighting awesome people in the open source ecosystem. You can also just donate to those people directly, but then their stories don't get out. So yeah, maybe do that. That's my contractual obligation to mention that this takes time and funds. What else can you do? You can like this podcast on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you're downloading and listening to it. And finally, you can go use PouchDB or use CouchDB or just generally be part of the awesome open source ecosystem. Submit to STF funding. See if you can get it. Then you get to work with these really cool people like Jan and Alba. And also just have a good day, which is exactly what I'm going to say to both of you. Thank you so much for coming on. This was really great. And thank you.
Thank you for having us.